The modern individual lives inside an arrangement that is simultaneously normalized, invisible, and coercive. This arrangement is called the state. Most people encounter it not as a theory but as a background condition. Taxes deducted automatically, laws enforced impersonally, borders defended by strangers in uniforms, currency accepted without question, violence delegated upwards and outward because it is omnipresent and routinized. The state is rarely interrogated at the level of first principles. Yet, when stripped of ceremony and rhetoric, the state reveals itself as a specific solution to a recurring historical problem: how to monopolize violence and suppress alternatives, coordinate large populations, and convert coercion into stability. At its core, the state is not defined by morality, democracy, or justice, despite how frequently these terms are invoked in its defenses. It is defined by its successes in establishing itself as the sole legitimate wielder of force within a territory. This legitimacy is not metaphysical, it is procedural. The state is legitimate because it has survived competition, elimination, and normalized obedience. What differentiates taxation from extortion, policing from vigilantism, war from murder is not the act itself, but the institutional context that authorizes it. The same action becomes lawful or criminal depending entirely on who performs it, under which banner. The reality becomes clearest when examiners examine the analogy between the state and a protection racket. If a private actor demands a percentage of income in exchange for protection from violence, the act is labeled as extortion. If the state demands a percentage of income in exchange for protection from violence, the act is labeled as taxation. Mechanically, these tools are indistinguishable. The differences lies in scale, organization, and the elimination of competitors. The state has successfully ensured that no alternative protection provider can operate openly. Once alternatives are removed, the monopoly ceases to feel like coercion and begins to feel like order. The monopoly on violence, however, is the only first layer of state power. Violence cannot sustain long-term control. Law coercion is expensive, unstable, and self-defeating if applied continuously. The state therefore supplements yeah, the state therefore supplements force with narrative authority. It defines which acts of violence are criminal and which are necessary, which deaths are murders and which are casualties, which confiscations are theft and which are taxes. This semantic control is not superficial; it determines how populations interpret events, assign blame, and internalize obedience. The state doesn't merely punish disobedience, it conditions the population to perceive obedience as normal and resistance as irrational or immoral. Closely, closely linked to this is state monopoly on coordination. Individuals can resent the state, distrust it, or even hate it, but resentment alone doesn't translate into effective opposition. Coordination requires communication, trust, and the ability to act collectively without being framed or neutralized. The state systematically disrupts such coordination through surveillance, legal deterrence, bureaucratic complexity, and social atomization. Dissenters remain isolated while the state operates as a unified actor capable of mobilizing resources, manpower, and information at scale. This asymmetry is more than ideology; it explains why states endure despite widespread dissatisfaction. The modern justification for this arrangement often appeals to consent, social contract, or democratic legitimacy. Explanations are partially true but fundamentally incomplete. Consent are rarely explicit and almost never revocable without cause. Social contracts are non-negotiable agreements but retrospective rationalizations. Democracy modifies elite circulation and policy direction but doesn't dissolve the underlying monopolies. Even the most democratic state retained exclusive control over taxation, punishment, and warfare. The structure remains intact regardless of who occupies the office. When examined historically, this reality becomes even clearer. States doesn't emerge through collective agreement, but through consolidation, conquest, and elimination of rivals. Feudal lords, tribal authorities, private armies, and religious militias were systematically absorbed or destroyed. What survives history is not what is just, but what is durable. Once consolidation success, the violence that created the state fades into the background, replaced by institutions that manage obedience more efficiently. At that point, belief follows power rather than gathering it. Legitimacy becomes the residue of stabilized dominance. Ancient political realism, particularly in civilizations that lacked modern surveillance and bureaucratic technologies, confronted this reality more directly. Without the ability to enforce compliance through constant monitoring, ancient states were forced to think deeply about legitimacy, overreach, and collapse. They understood that excess taxation, arbitrary punishment, or unrestrained violence eroded obedience and invited rebellion. As a result, they treated legitimacy as a moral absolute, but not as a moral absolute, but as a constitutional resource that could be depleted. Power was something to be managed, not merely asserted. This contrasts sharply with many modern states, which rely on technological capacity to compensate for declining legitimacy. Surveillance replaces trust. Debt replaces loyalty. Bureaucracy replaces personal authority. While effective in the short or medium term, this approach carries its own risks. When enforcement capacity outpaces legitimacy too dramatically, the system becomes brittle. Compliance continues, but not so long as the machinery functions without disruption. When shock occurs, whether economic, military, or informational, the lack of internalized legitimacy becomes visible. The question of war further exposes the asymmetry at the heart of state power. An individual who initiates violence against a neighbor is punished as a criminal, and a state that initiates violence against another state is said to be acting in self defense, national interest, or security. Conscription, expropriation, and suspense of right become acceptable under the banner of emergency. The moral evaluation of these actions depends entirely on outcome. Victory sanctifies, defeat criminalizes, history assigns blame to losers and legitimacy to winners, not because history is biased, but because legitimacy itself is retrospective. This doesn't imply that all actions are equal or morality is meaningless. It implies that morality operates downstream of power. Norms are enforced because institutions exist to enforce them, not the other way around. When institutional power shifts, norms follow. Currency has value because the state demands taxes in it and enforces contracts denominated in it. If enforcement collapses, belief collapses with it. The illusion is not belief, the illusion is that belief precedes power. Understanding the state in this way doesn't require hatred, rebellion, or nihilism. It requires realism. The state is neither a benevolent guardian nor a criminal conspirator. It is a coordinated mechanism that emerged because uncoordinated violence is much more destructive than monopolized violence. The question is not whether the state is coercive, but because it is by definition. The question is whether its coercion produces stability at an acceptable cost and whether any alternative can outperform it at scale. This perspective also resolves the confusion surrounding legitimacy. Legitimacy is not a moral endorsement but a practical condition in which obedience is cheaper than resistance. When most people comply automatically, legitimacy is high. When compliance requires constant force, legitimacy is low. States invest enormous resources in maintaining this condition not because they are moral, but because legitimacy reduces enforcement costs. It is efficiency, not virtue, that drives the system. In the end, the state persists because it has outcompeted alternatives in organizing violence, extracting resources, and coordinating populations. It's a monopoly because it has declared itself one, but because no rival has successfully replaced it. When rivals do emerge that organize more effectively, whether revolutionary movements, warlord systems, or parallel authorities, States collapses or transform. This has happened repeatedly throughout history and will happen again. To see the state clearly is not to reject it, but to stop mystifying it. Once stripped of illusion, the individual no longer needs to reconcile power with morality or obedience with belief. The machinery becomes visible. Compliance becomes a calculated choice rather than a moral reflex. Resistance becomes a strategic consideration rather than a romantic impulse. What remains is clarity, not comfort, and that clarity is the real conclusion.